The roar of the Pecos River filled Grace Vance's ears as she stood on the eastern bank, watching the muddy water rise with terrifying speed, swallowing rocks and sagebrush that had been dry ground only moments before. She had crossed earlier that morning when the water was barely knee-high, following the trail to collect medicinal herbs her grandmother needed desperately. But the spring storm in the mountains had sent a wall of water rushing downstream faster than anyone could have predicted. Now, in this April of 1878, she found herself stranded on the wrong side of the swollen river with night approaching, and no way home to Fort Sumner, New Mexico territory. Her basket of yarrow and sage felt heavy in her trembling hands as she scanned the opposite bank where her horse whinnied nervously, tied to a cottonwood tree. She had left him there, not wanting to risk him on the rocky terrain where the best herbs grew. That decision now seemed foolish beyond measure. The water churned brown and angry, carrying branches and debris that crashed against the few remaining stones visible above the surface. Grace was 19 years old and considered herself capable and independent, but she had never seen the river this wild, this hungry. The sun was lowering toward the distant mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Grace wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders, trying to think. Her grandmother was waiting back in town, already weak from the cough that had settled in her chest weeks ago. Without the medicine, without Grace to tend her, she might not survive another night. But what good would Grace be if she drowned trying to cross? She walked along the bank, searching for a narrower crossing point, but the river seemed to widen as she went, spreading its fury across the landscape. Her dark hair, usually pinned neatly beneath her bonnet, had come loose in her frantic searching, whipping around her face in the wind that accompanied the storm's aftermath. She was wearing her second-best dress, a practical brown calico that her grandmother had sewn, now muddy at the hem from her desperate exploration of the riverbank. Panic began to claw at her throat. She had been gone since dawn, and soon people would worry. Her grandmother would try to come looking despite her illness, or send someone from town. But who would think to look across the river? Everyone knew better than to cross during spring runoff. Everyone except Grace, apparently, who had been so focused on gathering the herbs that she had ignored the dark clouds building over the mountains. That was when she heard the horse. Not her own gentle mare across the water, but something else. The sound of hooves splashing through mud, moving with purpose. Grace turned toward the sound, hope and fear mixing in her chest. Out here, miles from town, a stranger could be dangerous, but a stranger might also be her only chance. Through the cottonwoods and junipers emerged a man on horseback, and Grace's first thought was that he looked like something from the old stories her grandmother told. He was massive, broad-shouldered and thick with muscle that was visible even beneath his buckskin shirt. His hair was dark brown and hung past his shoulders, wet from the mist of the river. His face was weathered and angular, with a strong jaw shadowed by several days of beard growth. He sat his horse with the easy confidence of someone who had spent more time in the saddle than on foot, and his dark eyes swept the riverbank with an alertness that spoke of years in wild country. The horse beneath him was equally impressive, a big roan stallion with the deep chest and powerful legs of a mountain-bred animal. As the man drew closer, Grace could see the rifle secured to his saddle, the knife at his belt, and the general air of self-sufficiency that marked him as someone who lived by his own terms, far from the constraints of civilized society. He pulled his horse to a stop when he saw her, those dark eyes taking in her situation with quick intelligence. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Grace found herself oddly breathless, though she told herself it was only the fear and exertion of the last hour. "You are stuck," he said finally, his voice deep and carrying easily over the river's roar. It was not a question. "Yes," Grace called back, moving closer to the water's edge so he could hear her better. "I crossed this morning before the storm. I did not think it would rise so fast." The man dismounted in one fluid motion, his boots hitting the ground with solid confidence. He was even taller than she had thought, well over 6 feet, with the kind of build that came from years of hard physical labor in unforgiving country. He walked to the river's edge, studying the water with the focused attention of someone reading a book. "Name is Boone Jameson," he called across to her. "I have a camp about 2 miles north. Saw you from higher ground, figured you might need help." "Grace Vance," she responded, relief flooding through her so intensely that her knees felt weak. "From Fort Sumner. My grandmother is sick. I need to get back to her." Boone was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving along the river, calculating something. Grace watched the play of emotions across his face, the careful consideration. This was not a man who acted rashly, she realized. Everything he did would be measured, deliberate. "Water is fast," he said finally, "but I have crossed worse. My horse is strong and I know this river." He turned those dark eyes directly on her, and Grace felt the full force of his attention like a physical thing. "But it will be dangerous. You need to trust me completely. If you panic or fight when we are in the current, we both drown." Grace's throat was dry. She looked at the churning water, at the debris still rushing past, then back at this stranger who was offering to risk his life for hers. In town, people would have called him dangerous, would have warned her away. Mountain men like Boone Jameson had a reputation for being wild, unpredictable, too long removed from civilized company. But standing here with the river between them, Grace saw only competence and an unexpected kindness in his offer. "I trust you," she said, and was surprised to find she meant it. Boone nodded once, sharply, then moved back to his horse. He removed several items from his saddle, securing them higher or leaving them on the bank, lightening the load. He checked the girth, tightened something on the bridle, all with the practiced efficiency of someone who had prepared for difficult river crossings many times before. Grace watched the muscles in his arms flex and shift beneath his shirt as he worked, the raw strength evident in every movement. When he was satisfied with his preparations, Boone swung back into the saddle. He gathered the reins, speaking quietly to his horse, then looked across at Grace one more time. "When I get close, I will reach for you. Take my arm with both hands and let me pull you up. Do not try to jump or reach too far. Let me do the work. Once you are up, hold tight to me and do not let go no matter what happens. Understand?" "Yes," Grace called back, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. Boone turned his horse to face upstream, giving them an angle to work with against the current. Then, with what looked like a simple nudge of his heels, he urged the big roan into the water. Grace held her breath as horse and rider entered the river. For the first few steps, it seemed manageable. The water rose to the horse's knees, then its chest. But then they hit the main current, and Grace saw the real power of the river as it grabbed at them, trying to sweep them downstream. The roan stumbled, caught itself, pushed forward with tremendous effort. Boone sat deep in the saddle, his body moving with the horse, becoming part of its struggle against the water. They were making progress, fighting their way across, but it was slow and Grace could see the strain on the horse's face, the way its nostrils flared with effort. Boone's jaw was set hard, his entire focus on keeping them moving forward. Water splashed up around them, soaking them both. A large branch came tumbling downstream and Grace gasped, certain it would hit them, but Boone saw it and guided his horse just enough to let it pass behind them. They were past the middle now, in the deeper part where the current ran strongest. The horse was swimming, its hooves no longer touching bottom, and Boone shifted his weight, helping to keep them balanced against the water's pull. For several terrifying seconds, they seemed to make no progress at all, the horse swimming hard but the current holding them in place. Then, inch by inch, they began to move forward again. The horse's hooves found purchase on the riverbed. They were in shallower water, close enough now that Grace could see the water streaming from Boone's hair, the intense concentration in his eyes. "Get ready," he called out, his voice strained from the effort. Grace dropped her basket and moved to the very edge of the bank, her heart in her throat. The horse lunged up out of the deeper water, sending spray everywhere, and suddenly Boone was right there, his arm extended toward her. "Now," he commanded. Grace reached up and grabbed his forearm with both hands. His skin was cold from the river, but the muscle beneath was like iron, solid and unyielding. Immediately his hand clamped around her arm, and with strength that seemed impossible, he lifted her as if she weighed nothing at all. Grace felt herself leaving the ground, swinging up, and then his other arm came around her waist, and she was on the horse in front of him, pressed against his chest. "Hold on," he said, his voice right by her ear, and Grace wrapped her arms around the saddle horn as Boone wheeled the horse back toward the river. The reality of what was about to happen hit her all at once. They were going back into that terrible current, but this time she would be in it too. The horse took its first steps back into the water, and Grace felt the cold shock of it against her legs, soaking through her skirt instantly. "I have got you," Boone said behind her, and his arm tightened around her waist, holding her secure against him. "Trust the horse. He knows what to do." The water rose higher and higher still. Grace felt the moment the horse began to swim, the strange floating sensation as the current grabbed them. She wanted to cry out, to struggle, but she remembered Boone's warning and forced herself to stay still. His body was solid behind her, unmovable despite the water's fury. She could feel the controlled power in him, the way he used his weight and balance to help the horse, to keep them all together. A wave hit them sideways and Grace gasped, certain they would be swept under, but Boone's arm never loosened and the horse never stopped fighting. Water was in her nose, her mouth, cold and tasting of mud and storm. She could not breathe properly, could not see clearly, could only hold on and trust that the man and horse carrying her knew what they were doing. Then suddenly, they were through the worst of it. The horse's hooves touched bottom, found solid ground, and with a tremendous surge of effort, the big roan lunged up onto the western bank. Grace was coughing, gasping, her entire body shaking from cold and fear and relief. They were across. They had made it. Boone dismounted first, then reached up and lifted Grace down as easily as if she were a child. Her legs were shaking too badly to hold her weight and she stumbled, but he steadied her with his hands on her shoulders, looking down at her with concern. "Are you hurt?" His voice was gentler now, the urgency of the crossing past. Grace shook her head, still coughing. "No, I am fine, thank you. Thank you so much." She realized she was crying, tears mixing with the river water on her face. The magnitude of what had just happened, what he had just done for her, overwhelmed her completely. He had risked his life for a stranger, crossed that terrible river twice when once had nearly killed him. Boone seemed uncomfortable with her tears. He released her shoulders and stepped back, giving her space. "We need to get you warm," he said practically. "My camp is not far. You can dry out there, and I will take you back to Fort Sumner in the morning when the water has had time to drop." "My grandmother," Grace protested weakly. "She needs medicine. She is sick." "What kind of medicine?" Boone asked, his eyes sharpening with interest. Yarrow for fever, sage for her cough. I had gathered them, but I dropped the basket. Grace looked back across the river where her carefully collected herbs were probably floating downstream by now. To her surprise, Boone almost smiled. It softened his hard features, made him look younger. I have yarrow at my camp, and sage. Other things too. I will give you what you need. Grace stared at him. You have medicine. Living alone in the mountains, you learn what plants can help and which can hurt, Boone said simply. He moved to check his horse, running expert hands over the animal's legs, checking for injury. This fellow needs rest and warmth same as you. Come on. He gathered his horse's reins and started walking, clearly expecting Grace to follow. She did, though her legs were still unsteady and her wet skirts clung heavily to her legs. Her mind was spinning, trying to process everything that had happened in the last hour. She had nearly died. This stranger had saved her. And now he was taking her to his camp, offering medicine for her grandmother as if these were perfectly ordinary things. The walk to his camp took longer than Grace expected, partly because of her exhaustion and partly because Boone's idea of not far was clearly shaped by years of mountain travel. But finally, they emerged into a small clearing where he had made his temporary home. It was surprisingly well organized, with a lean-to shelter for his supplies, a ring of stones for his fire, and evidence of careful attention to the details of outdoor living. Boone tied his horse on a long line where the animal could reach grass and water, then efficiently stripped off the wet saddle and blanket. He rubbed the horse down with a dry cloth, checking it over again for any sign of strain or injury from the crossing. Only when he was satisfied with the animal's condition did he turn his attention back to Grace. She was standing awkwardly near the fire ring, still dripping, unsure what to do with herself. Boone studied her for a moment, then moved to the lean-to and pulled out a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. "Blanket," he said, holding it out to her. "Get out of those wet clothes and wrap up in this. I will turn my back, work on the fire." Grace took the blanket with numb fingers. It smelled like wood smoke and something else, something clean and outdoorsy that she could not quite name. Boone was already moving away, true to his word, gathering wood and arranging it in the fire ring. Grace hesitated only a moment before her shaking became too violent to ignore. She quickly stripped off her sodden dress and undergarments, wringing what water she could from them, then wrapped herself in the blanket. It was thick and warm, and she pulled it tight around her body, feeling slightly more human. "You can turn around," she said, her voice small. Boone glanced back to confirm she was decent, then continued his work with the fire. Within minutes he had it blazing, the heat a blessed relief against Grace's cold skin. He spread her clothes near the fire to dry, arranging them with care, then retrieved a pot and began preparing something. "Coffee will be ready soon," he said, "and I will make you something to eat. You need heat inside and out." Grace settled onto a log near the fire, tucking the blanket more securely around herself. Now that the immediate danger was past, she found herself studying Boone with more attention. He moved with the grace of someone completely comfortable in his environment, every action economical and purposeful. His wet buckskin shirt clung to his broad shoulders and thick arms, defining the powerful muscles beneath. His long hair was drying in the heat of the fire, falling around his face as he worked. "How long have you lived in the mountains?" Grace asked, needing to break the silence. "Most of my life," Boone replied, not looking up from the pot he was stirring. "Grew up in Tennessee, came west when I was 15. That was 10 years ago. Spent time trapping, hunting, guiding wagon trains sometimes. But mostly I stay up high away from towns." Grace did some quick calculation. He was 25 then. She had thought him older, but she supposed the outdoor life aged a person's appearance. Why away from towns? Boone was quiet for a moment, considering. Towns have too many rules, too many people wanting things from you. Mountains are honest. An animal that wants to kill you does not pretend otherwise. Weather does not lie about what it intends. I prefer honest dangers to civilized deceptions. There was a story there, Grace sensed, some hurt or betrayal that had driven him to solitude, but she did not press. Instead, she asked, "Do you ever get lonely?" This time Boone did look up, his dark eyes meeting hers across the fire. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but lonely is better than surrounded by people who see you as something you are not." Grace thought about that while he poured coffee into 2 tin cups. He brought one to her, their fingers brushing as she took it, and she felt an unexpected warmth that had nothing to do with the hot liquid. She sipped carefully, letting the coffee's heat work through her. Boone had prepared a simple meal of beans and salt pork, but to Grace's starved and chilled body it tasted like the finest feast. She ate gratefully, feeling strength returning to her limbs. The fire was doing its work too, drying her hair and warming her skin. Across from her, Boone ate his own meal in silence, but it was a comfortable silence, not awkward or strained. When they had finished eating, Boone went to a leather bag hanging from a tree branch and began pulling out bundles of dried herbs. "Tell me your grandmother's symptoms," he said. Grace described the cough that had started dry but progressed to something deeper and more painful, the fever that came and went, the weakness that kept her grandmother bedridden most days. Boone listened intently, then selected several bundles with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. "Yarrow for the fever," he said, setting each bundle aside as he named it. "Sage for the cough, mullein to help her breathe easier, and elderberry for strength." He found a cloth bag and carefully measured portions of each herb into it, mixing them with practiced ease. "Steep a palmful of this mixture in hot water, as hot as she can drink it, 3 times a day. She should start feeling better within 2 days. How do you know so much about healing?" Grace asked, amazed. "Had a Shoshone woman teach me years back," Boone said. "I had taken a bullet and her people found me, nursed me back. She said I had the touch for healing, that I understood how plants and body work together. She taught me everything she knew before I left." "You should be a doctor," Grace said impulsively. Boone's expression turned sardonic. "Doctors need medical school fancy degrees. I am just a mountain man who knows some herbs. It is not the same." But it was, Grace thought. Knowledge was knowledge, skill was skill, regardless of where it came from. The prejudice against people like Boone, people who lived outside society's structures, suddenly struck her as profoundly unfair. The sun had set fully now, and the only light came from the fire. Stars were beginning to appear overhead, brilliant in the clear air after the storm. Grace realized she was warm and dry, her immediate needs met, but she felt no urgency to sleep. Instead, she found herself wanting to talk to this unexpected man, to understand him better. "Tell me about the mountains," she said. "What is it like up there?" And so Boone talked, his deep voice painting pictures of high meadows filled with wildflowers, of elk herds moving through morning mist, of winter storms that could bury a cabin overnight. He spoke of the constant challenge of survival, yes, but also of a kind of freedom and peace that Grace had never experienced in town life. He talked about watching the seasons change from a perspective most people never saw, about the satisfaction of living by one's own skills and strength. Grace listened, fascinated. She had never thought much about life beyond Fort Sumner, beyond the ordinary rhythm of town existence. But hearing Boone describe his world, she felt something stir in her chest, a longing for something she could not quite name. "It sounds beautiful," she said when he paused. It is, Boone agreed, but hard. Not everyone can take it. Do you ever bring anyone with you, friends? No friends to bring, Boone said simply. Folks in the towns. They are friendly enough when they need a guide or a hunter, but they do not want much to do with me otherwise. And other mountain men, we cross paths sometimes, but mostly we keep to ourselves. The loneliness of his life struck Grace forcefully. Here was this strong, capable, intelligent man, and he lived in complete isolation simply because he did not fit into the neat categories of civilized society. It seemed a terrible waste. You must think us very foolish, Grace said. Town people, I mean, trapped by our own rules and judgments. Boone considered this. Not foolish, just different. Everyone finds their own way to survive. Mine is the mountains. Yours is Fort Sumner and taking care of your grandmother. My grandmother is all I have left, Grace said quietly. My parents died of cholera when I was 12. She took me in, raised me, taught me everything I know. I owe her my life. Then we will make sure she gets well, Boone said with simple certainty, and Grace believed him. They talked for hours more, the conversation flowing easily despite their vastly different backgrounds. Grace told him about life in Fort Sumner, about the characters in town, about her work helping her grandmother with sewing and occasionally teaching the younger children their letters. Boone listened with genuine interest, asking questions that showed he was really paying attention. At some point, exhaustion began to overtake Grace's adrenaline and coffee-fueled energy. She found herself yawning, fighting to keep her eyes open. You need sleep, Boone said, noticing immediately. You can have the shelter. I will keep the fire going and sleep out here. I cannot take your shelter, Grace protested. You are not taking it, I am offering it. Boone stood, making it clear the discussion was over. Come on, I will get you settled. The shelter was small but dry, with Boone's bedroll already laid out. He started to remove it, but Grace stopped him with a hand on his arm. Even through his now dry shirt, she could feel the solid muscle beneath, the coiled strength. Please, she said. You have done so much already. Let me at least use my own blanket. You keep yours. They compromised, with Grace using his bedroll but Boone keeping his blanket to wrap up in by the fire. Grace crawled into the shelter, the bedroll still holding a faint warmth and that same clean, outdoorsy scent she had noticed earlier. She could see Boone through the opening, settling himself against a log, his rifle within easy reach. Boone, she called softly. Yes, thank you for everything. You saved my life today. Get some sleep, Grace, was all he said, but his voice was gentle. Grace closed her eyes, listening to the crackle of the fire and the night sounds of the wilderness. She should have been afraid, alone in the mountains with a strange man, but instead she felt safer than she had in years. There was something about Boone, something fundamental and trustworthy, that put her completely at ease. She drifted off to sleep thinking about his eyes, dark and intense, and the way he had held her so securely during that terrible river crossing. Morning came with birdsong and the smell of coffee. Grace woke slowly, disoriented for a moment before remembering where she was. She sat up and looked out of the shelter to find Boone already up, the fire rebuilt, breakfast cooking. Her dress and undergarments were dry, folded neatly and placed just inside the shelter entrance. Grace dressed quickly, grateful to be back in her own clothes even if they were wrinkled and still slightly stiff from their river dunking. When she emerged, Boone handed her a cup of coffee without comment and went back to tending the food. How far is it to Fort Sumner? Grace asked. Maybe 3 hours on foot, Boone replied. Less on horse, but I only have the one and he needs to carry supplies. We will walk together. I want to make sure you get back safe. Grace's heart did an odd little skip at the thought of 3 more hours in his company. You do not need to do that. You have already done so much. River might still be high in places. Better to have company. Boone looked up from the pan, his expression serious. Besides, I want to make sure your grandmother gets that medicine and knows how to use it properly. They ate breakfast together as the sun climbed higher, burning off the last of the morning chill. Boone efficiently packed up his camp, moving with the practiced speed of someone who had done this countless times. He scattered the fire, erased signs of his presence, and soon it was as if no one had ever been there at all. The walk to Fort Sumner was pleasant in the growing warmth of the day. Boone led his horse, setting a comfortable pace that Grace could easily maintain. They talked as they walked, the conversation picking up where it had left off the night before. Grace found herself telling him things she rarely shared, thoughts and dreams she had hardly acknowledged to herself. "I always wanted to travel," she admitted, "to see what is beyond the next hill, the next town, but grandmother needs me, and besides, it is not something women do alone." "Some women do," Boone said. "Met a few over the years. Takes courage, but it can be done." "Did you ever want to settle down?" Grace asked. "Have a family?" Boone was quiet for a long moment. "Thought about it sometimes. But what woman would want to live the way I do? And I cannot live the way they would want, so I stopped thinking about it." There was resignation in his voice, acceptance of what he saw as an unchangeable fact. Grace wanted to argue, to say that surely there was a woman somewhere who would appreciate his strength and competence, his knowledge and quiet kindness. But she held her tongue, unsure why the topic made her chest feel tight. They were approaching Fort Sumner now, the town visible in the distance. Grace felt an unexpected reluctance, a wish that the walk could have been longer. Soon they would be back in civilization, and Boone would disappear back into his mountains, and this strange, intense interlude in her life would be over. Fort Sumner was not a large town, having grown up around the old military fort that gave it its name. The fort itself was abandoned now, but the town that had sprung up to serve it remained, a collection of adobe buildings and wooden storefronts clustered along a few dusty streets. People were going about their morning business as Grace and Boone entered town, and she could feel the curious looks following them. Boone attracted attention wherever he went, Grace realized. His size alone would have done it, but combined with his long hair, buckskin clothing, and general appearance of wildness, he stood out dramatically among the town folk in their ordinary dress. Grace saw women whispering to each other, men eyeing Boone warily. It made her angry on his behalf, these snap judgments from people who knew nothing about him. "My grandmother's house is this way," Grace said, leading him down a side street to a small adobe building with a neatly swept front step. Inside, Grace found her grandmother right where she had left her, in bed but awake and looking worried. Martha Vance was a small woman, made smaller by illness, but her eyes were still sharp and her spirit undimmed. "Grace, thank heavens! I was so worried when the river rose and you did not return." "I was about to send for help." Her eyes moved past Grace to Boone, filling the doorway. "And who is this?" "This is Boone Jameson, grandmother. He saved my life. I was trapped on the other side of the river and he rode through the current to get me." Grace moved to her grandmother's bedside, taking the frail hand in hers. "He has medicine for you too." Boone had removed his hat upon entering and now stood awkwardly in the small room, too large and too male for the delicate domestic space. But he moved forward when Grace gestured, pulling the herb mixture from his coat pocket. "Madam," he said respectfully, "Grace told me about your condition. I have prepared something that should help." Martha studied him with the keen assessment of someone who had seen much in her 70 years. Whatever she saw must have satisfied her because she nodded. "You have my thanks for bringing my granddaughter home safely, Mr. Jameson, and for the medicine. Will you show Grace how to prepare it? Of course. Boone turned to Grace. You need a pot for water and a cup for steeping. Grace led him to the small kitchen area where she set water to boil over the stove. As they waited, Boone explained again how to prepare the mixture, how much to use, how often her grandmother should drink it. His hands were gentle as he showed her how to measure the herbs, and Grace found herself watching those hands, remembering how they had lifted her so effortlessly, held her so securely. Grace, Boone's voice broke through her distraction. Did you understand? Yes, sorry, I understand. Grace felt her cheeks warm and busied herself with the tea preparation. When the tea was ready, she brought it to her grandmother and helped her drink it. Martha made a face at the bitter taste but drank obediently, and Grace could see the trust in her grandmother's eyes when she looked at Boone. Will you stay for a meal, Mr. Jameson? Martha asked. It is the least we can offer after what you have done. Boone looked uncomfortable, clearly eager to leave the confines of town, but he glanced at Grace and something in her expression must have convinced him. That would be kind, madam. Thank you. Grace prepared a simple meal of beans and cornbread, along with the last of the dried beef they had. It was nothing fancy, but Boone ate it with appreciation, complimenting her cooking in a way that made her blush again. They sat around Martha's bedside, the older woman insisting on hearing the full story of Grace's rescue. When Boone described riding through the current, Martha's hand tightened on Grace's. You took a terrible risk, young man. Worth it, Boone said simply, his eyes on Grace. After the meal, Boone stood to leave. I should be getting back. Got traps to check, camp to move. Grace walked him to the door, her heart unaccountably heavy. Will you ever come back to Fort Sumner? Maybe, Boone said. Come through every few months usually, trade furs and such. But I cannot say when for certain. Grace nodded, understanding. His life was not one of schedules and certainties. Well, if you do, please come by, check on grandmother's health, and so I can thank you properly. You already thanked me. But Boone was looking at her intently, that dark gaze seeming to see right through her. Take care of yourself, Grace Vance. You too, Boone Jameson. He settled his hat on his head, gathered his horse's reins, and walked away down the street. Grace stood in the doorway watching until he disappeared around a corner, feeling like something important was walking away with him. Back inside, Martha was regarding her granddaughter with knowing eyes. That is quite a man. Yes, Grace agreed softly. He looked at you like you were water in the desert. Grace turned sharply to her grandmother. What? I may be old and sick, child, but I am not blind. That man has feelings for you, whether he knows it yet or not. Grandmother, he just met me yesterday. He was being helpful, that is all. If you say so. Martha settled back into her pillows, a small smile on her lips. But mark my words, we have not seen the last of Boone Jameson. The days that followed were difficult for Grace. She tended her grandmother faithfully, administering the herbal tea 3 times daily as Boone had instructed. And wonder of wonders, it worked. Within 2 days, Martha's cough had eased. Within a week, the fever broke completely. Within 2 weeks, she was up and moving around the house, still weak but clearly on the mend. But even as Grace rejoiced in her grandmother's recovery, she found her thoughts returning again and again to Boone. She would be washing dishes and suddenly remember the feel of his arm around her waist in the river. She would be sewing and think about his hands measuring herbs, so large and capable. At night, she lay awake remembering their conversations, the sound of his voice, the way he had looked at her across the campfire. It was ridiculous, she told herself. She had spent barely a day in his company. He was a virtual stranger who lived a life completely incompatible with hers. He probably had not thought of her once since leaving town, but her heart refused to listen to logic. Spring turned to early summer, and Grace threw herself into keeping busy. She took in more sewing, helped neighbors with their children, worked in the small vegetable garden behind the house. Anything to keep her mind occupied. But nothing really helped. The memory of Boone Jameson was like a splinter under her skin, impossible to ignore. Nearly 2 months had passed since the river rescue when Grace went to the general store for supplies. She was examining a bolt of fabric when the conversation of 2 men near the counter caught her attention. "I am telling you, those mountain men are no good," one man was saying. "Dangerous, unpredictable. That fellow who came through in April, the big one, he had the look of a killer about him." Grace's hands stilled on the fabric. "Now, Tom, you do not know that," the second man replied. "Heard he helped Grace Vance when she was caught by the river. Probably just wanted a reward, or worse. You know how those wild men are around decent women." Grace felt anger surge through her, hot and fierce. She abandoned the fabric and marched over to the men. "Excuse me, but I could not help overhearing. That man you are slandering saved my life. He risked himself twice crossing a flooded river to help a complete stranger. He gave me medicine for my grandmother, and he behaved with perfect respect the entire time. I will not stand here and listen to you besmirch his character out of ignorance and prejudice." Both men stared at her, mouths slightly open. Women in Fort Sumner did not typically speak so forcefully, especially not unmarried young women to older men. "Well, Tom sputtered, "I did not mean—" "Yes, you did," Grace cut him off. "You meant exactly what you said, which was cruel and unfair. Boone Jameson is worth 10 of most men I have met in this town." She completed her purchases in furious silence and walked home with her head high, but inside she was shaking. She had just made a spectacle of herself defending a man who was not even there to hear it and might never know what she had done. But she could not have stayed silent. The thought of Boone being talked about that way, judged and dismissed by people who had never bothered to know him, was unbearable. That evening, Grace sat with her grandmother in the cooling air, shelling peas for supper. Martha had regained most of her strength and was back to her usual routines, for which Grace was deeply grateful. "You are thinking about him again," Martha observed. Grace did not bother denying it. "I defended him today, at the store. Some men were saying awful things and I could not bear it. Good for you." Martha's fingers worked steadily at the peas. "That must have shocked them down to their boots." "Grandmother, what is wrong with me? I cannot stop thinking about him. I barely know him. It has been 2 months and I still—" "Nothing is wrong with you, child. You are in love." The words hung in the evening air, simple and true. Grace felt them settle into her chest, heavy and certain. "But that is foolish," she whispered. "He is gone. He probably will never come back. And even if he did, what then? He lives in the mountains. I live here. There is no way for it to work." "Love rarely asks permission or considers practicality," Martha said. "It just is. What you do about it, that is the question." "What can I do?" "I cannot very well ride out into the mountains looking for him." "Why not?" Grace stared at her grandmother. Because I do not know where he is, because it is dangerous, because it is not done." "Grace, I am old. I could die tomorrow or live another 10 years, no one knows. But I will tell you what I have learned. Regret is harder to live with than failure. If you have a chance at love, real love, you take it. Even if it is frightening, even if it is unconventional, you take it." Grace thought about this as the sun set and the stars came out. Could she really do such a thing? Leave everything she knew and go looking for a mountain man who might not want to be found? It seemed insane. But the alternative, living the rest of her life wondering what might have been, seemed worse. She was still wrestling with the question a week later, when fate took the decision out of her hands. Grace was walking back from the schoolhouse where she had been helping with the younger children when she saw a familiar figure leading a horse down the main street. Her heart stopped, then started again at double speed. It was Boone. He looked much as he had 2 months before, perhaps a bit leaner, his skin darker from the summer sun. He was carrying furs to trade, she realized, which must be what brought him to town. As she watched, he tied his horse outside the trading post and went inside. Grace's feet carried her toward the trading post without conscious decision. She stopped outside, suddenly nervous. What if he did not remember her? What if he did remember her but had no interest in seeing her again? What if she was making a fool of herself? But then she thought of her grandmother's words about regret being worse than failure, and she pushed open the door. The trading post was dim after the bright sunshine outside. Boone was at the counter, negotiating with the trader over his furs. He did not notice Grace enter, focused on his business. She hung back, watching him, noting the familiar, competent way he handled the transaction. When he was finished and turned to leave, his eyes swept the store and landed on her. For a moment, his expression was unreadable. Then something flickered in his dark eyes, something warm and surprised and pleased. "Grace," he said, and her name in his deep voice sent shivers through her. "Hello, Boone." Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "I was hoping you would come back." "Was checking on your grandmother," he said, though his eyes never left Grace's face. "Wanted to make sure she recovered fully." "She did, thanks to you." Grace moved closer, very aware of the trader watching them with interest. "She is wonderful now. Full of energy and bossing me around like always." A smile tugged at Boone's mouth. "Good. That is good." They stood there looking at each other, the space between them charged with everything unspoken. The trader cleared his throat pointedly, and Boone seemed to remember where they were. "Can I walk you home?" he asked, "please." Outside in the sunshine, they walked side by side down the dusty street. Grace was intensely aware of him, of his size and warmth, of the way people moved out of their path and stared. Let them stare, she thought fiercely. Let them see that someone valued this good man. "How have you been?" Grace asked. "Did you have a good season?" "Good enough. Hunting was decent, pelts came out nice." Boone glanced down at her. "What about you? Keeping busy?" "Very." "Grandmother recovered so quickly she was back to work within 3 weeks. We have been sewing, keeping up with the garden, the usual things." Grace hesitated, then decided to risk honesty. "I thought about you. Often." Boone's steps slowed. When he spoke, his voice was rough. "I thought about you too, more than I should have." "Why should you not?" "Because I do not have anything to offer you, Grace. I live rough, move around, have no proper home. You deserve better than what I could give you." They had reached her grandmother's house. Grace stopped at the door and turned to face him fully. "What if I do not want better? What if I want exactly what you could give me?" Boone looked at her with such intensity that Grace felt stripped bare, every feeling exposed. "Do not say things you do not mean." "I mean it." Grace's heart was pounding, but she refused to look away. "I have spent 2 months trying to forget you, and I cannot. I do not want to." "Boone, Grace." "Is that you?" Martha's voice came from inside. "Bring our guest in. Do not leave him standing on the step." The moment broke, and Grace led Boone inside. If he was surprised that Martha was not only up but looking healthy and strong, he hid it well. He greeted her with respectful warmth, accepted her offer of coffee, and settled into a chair that seemed too small for his large frame. Martha questioned him about his health, his travels, his plans, with the thoroughness of someone interviewing a potential grandson-in-law. Grace was mortified, but Boone took it in stride, answering honestly and without apparent discomfort. "So you will be staying in the area for a while?" Martha asked. "Few days, maybe. Need to restock some supplies, trade what I have, then I will head back up." "And you will be alone up there? No one to watch your back or care for you if you are hurt or sick?" "I manage," Boone said. "I am sure you do, but it is a hard way to live all alone." Martha's eyes were sharp on his face. "Do you ever think of finding a partner, someone to share the load?" "Grandmother," Grace said, her face burning. "What? It is a reasonable question." Martha turned back to Boone. "Well," Boone's jaw tightened. When he spoke, he looked directly at Grace, not Martha. "I used to think no one would want that life. Lately, I have been wondering if I was wrong." "You were wrong," Grace said clearly, her heart in her throat. "Someone would want it, I would want it." The silence that followed was profound. Martha stood with a satisfied smile. "I will go check on something in the garden. You two talk." When they were alone, Boone rose from his chair and moved to stand in front of Grace. He was so tall she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "You do not know what you are saying," he said, but there was hope in his voice, naked and vulnerable. "I do. I have had 2 months to think about nothing else." Grace reached up and placed her hand on his chest, feeling his heart beating hard beneath her palm. "I know it would be hard. I know it would be so different from everything I have known. But Boone, when I am with you, I feel more alive than I ever have. You make me want to see what is beyond the next hill." "Grace." Her name was almost a groan. "If I take you with me, I might not be able to bring you back. The mountains, they get into your blood. You might hate it, hate me for taking you there. Or I might love it, love you for showing me." His control broke. His hands came up to cup her face, careful despite their size and strength. "I have never wanted anything the way I want you. From the moment I saw you across that river, afraid but not panicking, brave even when you were terrified. But I will not trap you. If you come with me, it has to be because you truly want this life, not just because you think you want me. Boone Jameson, I want both. The life and the man are the same thing, cannot you see that?" Grace covered his hands with hers. "I am not some fragile town girl who will wilt at the first hardship. I am strong. I can learn. And I promise you I will not regret it." He kissed her then, and it was like the river crossing all over again, overwhelming and terrifying and wonderful. His mouth was firm and warm and thorough, claiming her with a certainty that made her knees weak. Grace kissed him back with all the pent-up longing of the last 2 months, her hands fisting in his shirt, pulling him closer. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Boone rested his forehead against hers. "I do not deserve you. Maybe not, but you are stuck with me anyway." Grace smiled up at him. "I love you, Boone. I think I started loving you the moment you rode into that river for me. I love you too." The words sounded rusty, as if he had never said them before and was not sure how they worked. "I will try to be a good husband to you, Grace. I will keep you safe, provide for you, cherish you every day of my life." "Husband," Grace's breath caught. "That is what you meant, is not it, when you said you would come with me?" Boone looked suddenly uncertain. "I assumed, but maybe I should not have." "No, you assumed correctly. I want to marry you, I want to be your wife and share your life." Grace felt joy bubbling up, bright and effervescent. "But I have to tell you, I have no skills for mountain living. I will have to learn everything. I will teach you. We will learn together." Boone kissed her again, softer this time, tender. "When can we leave? Is tomorrow too soon?" Martha returned from the garden to find them sitting close together, holding hands and talking quietly. She looked at their joined hands and smiled. "I take it you worked things out." "Grandmother, we are getting married," Grace said, "and I am going to live with Boone in the mountains." "I thought you might be." Martha moved to sit across from them. "Grace, are you certain this is what you want? I do not doubt Mr. Jameson's character, but it will be a difficult life." "I am certain. I have never been more certain of anything." Martha studied her granddaughter's face, then nodded. "Then you have my blessing. But I think you should do this properly. Get married in the church, have the town see it is a real union. Otherwise, there will be talk that will follow you both." Boone shifted uncomfortably. "I am not much for churches, madam. Nevertheless, it is important, for Grace's reputation and for your own standing. People will be more likely to respect your marriage if it is done officially." Grace squeezed Boone's hand. "She is right. I know you do not care what people think, but I would like to do this properly. Please." Boone looked at her upturned face and capitulated instantly. "If it is important to you, then we will do it." They married 3 days later in Fort Sumner's small church. Grace wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved by Martha all these years, and Boone wore new clothes purchased from the general store, looking uncomfortably civilized but handsome enough to make Grace's heart flutter. The ceremony was simple, attended by Martha and a handful of curious townspeople who had heard about the unusual match. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Boone kissed Grace with a tenderness that brought tears to Martha's eyes. They were so clearly in love, these two unlikely people, that even the doubters in the congregation had to acknowledge the genuine nature of their union. After the ceremony, there was a small gathering at Martha's house. Grace had insisted on this much celebration, wanting to honor the importance of the day. She moved through the room, accepting congratulations and well wishes, always aware of Boone's solid presence nearby. He was uncomfortable with the attention but bore it stoically, his eyes following Grace wherever she went. Finally, the gathering broke up, and they were left alone with Martha. Grace had packed her few belongings into a small trunk, taking only what was practical for her new life. It was not much, a few dresses, personal items, her mother's Bible. Everything else she was leaving behind. Saying goodbye to Martha was the hardest part. Grace clung to her grandmother, tears streaming down her face. "I will miss you so much, and I will miss you, child. But you are not going to the end of the earth. You will visit, and I will know you are happy. That is enough for me." Martha held Grace tight, then released her and turned to Boone. "You take care of my girl, you understand. She is precious." "I understand, madam." "I swear I will protect her with my life." Boone's voice was thick with emotion. "I know you will." Martha patted his arm. "Go on now. Go start your life together." Boone had purchased a horse for Grace during their 3 days in town, a gentle mare with a steady temperament. Grace was not an experienced rider, but she learned quickly, and they set out from Fort Sumner in the late afternoon, heading toward the mountains with the summer sun warm on their shoulders. As the town disappeared behind them and the open country spread ahead, Grace felt a weight lift from her chest. She was leaving everything she had ever known, yes, but she was also riding toward everything she had secretly dreamed of: adventure, freedom, and most importantly, love. They rode for several hours, Boone setting an easy pace that allowed them to talk as they traveled. He pointed out landmarks, plants, animal signs, beginning the education he had promised. Grace absorbed it all eagerly, asking questions, wanting to learn everything at once. As evening approached, Boone led them to a sheltered spot near a stream where they would camp for the night. Grace helped him establish the camp, feeling useful despite her inexperience. He was patient with her fumbling attempts, showing her how to do things without making her feel inadequate. They ate a simple supper as the stars came out overhead. Grace sat close to Boone, leaning against his solid warmth, feeling utterly content. This was her life now. This man, this wilderness, this freedom. "Are you happy?" Boone asked, his arm around her shoulders. "Happier than I knew was possible," Grace answered honestly. She turned to look up at him, this strong, gentle man who had changed her entire life. "Thank you for riding through that river for me. I would do it again 1,000 times." Boone kissed her forehead. "You are everything to me, Grace. Everything I did not know I needed." That night, they consummated their marriage under the stars, with only the wind and the water as witnesses. Boone was tender and careful with Grace, initiating her into the physical side of love with patience and obvious restraint. Grace gave herself to him completely, trusting him with her body as she had trusted him with her life in the river. Afterwards, wrapped in blankets with Boone's arms around her, Grace looked up at the star-filled sky and felt a profound sense of rightness. This was where she belonged. Not in a town bound by propriety and expectations, but here in the wild places with this wild, wonderful man. The weeks that followed were a revelation. Boone took Grace to his primary camp, a well-hidden spot high in the mountains where he had built a small but sturdy cabin. It was nothing fancy, just one room with a stone fireplace and a sleeping loft, but to Grace it was perfect. Her first real home with her husband, she threw herself into learning everything Boone could teach her. How to hunt and fish, how to identify edible and medicinal plants, how to track animals and read weather signs, how to preserve meat, tan hides, keep a fire going in wind and rain. Some things came easily, others were frustratingly difficult, but Grace persevered. She was determined to be a true partner to Boone, not a burden. Boone was an excellent teacher, patient and thorough. He clearly took pride in Grace's progress, praising her successes and gently correcting her mistakes. And in turn, Grace taught him things he had not realized he was missing. How to laugh more freely, how to share not just space but thoughts and feelings, how to be part of a pair rather than always alone. Their love deepened as summer progressed into fall. They learned each other's bodies and rhythms, discovering pleasure and comfort in their physical union. But it was more than just physical. They talked for hours, sharing their pasts, their dreams, their fears. Grace told Boone about her parents, about the loneliness of growing up without them. Boone told Grace about his own difficult childhood, about the father who had beaten him and the mother too weak to protect him, about running west as soon as he was old enough. "That is why you left civilization," Grace said, pieces falling into place. "Not just because you loved the mountains, but because you were running from what it represented." "Maybe," Boone admitted. "Hard to separate the two, but I am not running anymore. Now I am just living, with you." By October, when the aspen leaves turned gold and the elk began their mating calls, Grace could handle a rifle with reasonable accuracy, skin a rabbit without wasting meat, and identify a dozen medicinal plants by sight. She could ride her mare confidently over rough terrain and keep their cabin warm and clean. She was not perfect, still made mistakes and had much to learn, but she was competent. A true mountain woman. More importantly, she was deeply, profoundly happy. The hard work did not bother her, nor the isolation. She loved the rhythm of their days, the satisfying exhaustion of physical labor, the beauty that surrounded them always. And she loved Boone, loved him more each day as she saw his many strengths and few vulnerabilities, as he continued to show her in countless ways that she was cherished. One evening in late October, as they sat by their fire after supper, Grace had something to tell him. She had been fairly certain for a few weeks but had waited to be sure. "Boone," she said, taking his hand, "I am going to have a baby." He froze, his dark eyes going wide. "You are certain?" "Yes, I think it will come in the spring, maybe April or May." For a moment Boone said nothing, and Grace felt a flutter of worry. But then his face transformed, joy and wonder lighting it from within. "A baby! We are going to have a baby!" He pulled Grace into his arms, holding her with exquisite care as if she might break. "Thank you. Thank you for this gift." "It is our gift," Grace corrected, laughing at his overwhelming response. "We made this together." "I am going to be a father." Boone sounded awed. "I never thought I would be a father, never thought I deserved it." "You deserve it. You deserve all good things." Grace cupped his face in her hands. "You are going to be wonderful, Boone. Our child is so lucky to have you." The winter that followed was long and cold, but Grace had never been warmer. Boone was attentive to her every need as her pregnancy progressed, sometimes overly so. He fussed over her constantly, worried about her health, about the baby, about his ability to deliver it safely when the time came. "Women have been having babies for thousands of years," Grace reminded him gently when his worry became too much. "My body knows what to do." "But what if something goes wrong? What if you need help and I do not know how to give it?" Grace understood his fear. They were far from any doctor or midwife, dependent entirely on Boone's wilderness medicine skills. But she trusted him completely, trusted his knowledge and his steady hands. "You will know what to do. I am not worried, so you should not be either." They made it through the winter in good health, their cabin cozy against the snow and cold. Grace continued to work as much as her changing body allowed, and Boone supplemented their stored food with fresh game whenever possible. They talked about names for the baby, about what kind of life they would provide. They made plans and dreamed dreams, closer than ever. Spring came early in 1879, the snow melting rapidly under warm sunshine. And with the spring came Grace's labor, starting in the pre-dawn hours of a May morning with pains that grew steadily stronger. Boone was magnificent. Despite his earlier fears, when the moment came he was calm and capable, talking Grace through each contraction, supporting her physically and emotionally. The labor was long and difficult, as first labors often are, but Grace drew strength from Boone's unwavering presence. As the sun was setting, painting their mountain meadow in shades of gold, Grace gave birth to a son. Boone caught the baby in his large, careful hands and lifted the squalling infant up where Grace could see him. "A boy," Boone said, his voice rough with tears. "We have a son, Grace." Grace was exhausted but exultant. Their son was perfect, with a full head of dark hair and powerful lungs that announced his displeasure at this new world. Boone cleaned him gently and wrapped him in soft cloth, then placed him in Grace's arms. "Hello, little one," Grace whispered, touching the baby's tiny hand. "We have been waiting for you." They named him Matthew after Grace's father and called him Matt from the start. He was a healthy, hungry baby who kept them busy and sleepless but filled their cabin with joy. Boone was a devoted father, tender with his son in a way that made Grace fall in love with him all over again. This huge, strong man who could survive anything the wilderness threw at him was completely undone by one tiny baby. Grace recovered well from the birth, her strength returning quickly. Within weeks, she was back to most of her usual activities, though now with Matt strapped to her back or sleeping nearby. Motherhood came naturally to her, and she loved watching Boone with their son, the fierce protectiveness and gentle care he showed. They established new rhythms as a family of three. Boone hunted and trapped, Grace managed their home and garden and tended Matt, and together they built a life that was rich in everything that mattered. They had love, health, purpose, and each other. What more could anyone want? When Matt was 6 months old, they made the journey down to Fort Sumner to visit Martha. The older woman was overjoyed to meet her great-grandson, holding him with tears of happiness streaming down her face. "He is beautiful, Grace, so beautiful. And you look wonderful, absolutely glowing." "I am happy, grandmother, so happy." Grace meant it completely. The last year and a half had been the best of her life. Martha studied her granddaughter, seeing the truth in her eyes. "I am so glad. I worried at first, I admit, about such a dramatic change in your life. But I can see this is exactly where you are meant to be." They stayed in Fort Sumner for a week, letting Martha spend time with Matt and restocking their supplies. Grace noticed the way people looked at her now, with a mix of confusion and grudging respect. She had married a mountain man and disappeared into the wilderness, but she had returned healthy and happy with a thriving child. It challenged their assumptions about what such a life must be like. Before they left, Martha pulled Grace aside. "I have something for you." She handed Grace a leather-bound journal, its pages blank. "Write down your life, child. Write about your adventures, your family. Someday Matt will want to know his history, and this will help him understand." Grace accepted the journal gratefully, touched by her grandmother's thoughtfulness. I will write everything." They returned to the mountains, to their cabin and their life. And Grace did write whenever she had a quiet moment. She wrote about her days, about Matt's first tooth and first words, about the wildlife they encountered and the changing seasons. She wrote about her love for Boone, trying to capture on paper what he meant to her, even though words seemed inadequate. Years passed in contentment. Matt grew from infant to toddler to sturdy little boy, running fearlessly through the wilderness that was his home. He learned to ride almost before he could walk, tagging along with his father on short trips, absorbing Boone's knowledge through observation and practice. When Matt was 3, Grace became pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, her body knowing what to do. And when their second child arrived in the spring of 1882, it was a daughter. Grace held her tiny girl and marveled at the delicate perfection of her features, so different from Matt's sturdy robustness. They named her Emma, and she was the image of Grace with her grandmother Martha's eyes. Boone was just as smitten with his daughter as he had been with his son, cradling her tiny form in his huge hands with infinite gentleness. Matt was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to help with everything, already showing the protective instincts he had learned from his father. Their family was complete now, and their life settled into a comfortable pattern. Summers were for hunting and gathering, for teaching the children about the world around them. Winters were for staying close to home, for storytelling by the fire and teaching Matt his letters from Grace's precious books. They made trips to Fort Sumner once or twice a year, maintaining their connection to Martha and civilization while always being eager to return to their mountain home. The children grew healthy and strong, raised in freedom and love. Matt became his father's shadow, learning to track and hunt and survive in the wilderness. Emma was more like Grace, interested in plants and medicine, already showing a healer's touch with injured animals. Together, they were a tight-knit unit, depending on each other absolutely, but never feeling limited by their isolation. Grace sometimes thought about the girl she had been before the river crossing, the girl who had thought her life would be an endless repetition of sewing and housekeeping in Fort Sumner. That girl would not recognize the woman she had become, strong and capable and utterly free. She could shoot a rifle, deliver a baby, survive a winter storm. She could read the sky and the land, tend wounds, teach children. She was everything she had never known she could be. And it was all because Boone had ridden through that swollen river when he had no reason to risk his life for a stranger. Grace thanked Providence daily for that moment, for the courage and kindness that had driven him to help her. From that single act had flowed all the joy and love of her life. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked Boone one evening when the children were asleep and they sat together watching the stars. "Coming to help me that day, your life would be simpler without a family to worry about." Boone turned to her, his expression serious. "Simpler is not better. You and the children, you are the best thing that ever happened to me. I was not really living before you, just existing. You taught me what it meant to have a purpose beyond simple survival." "I love you," Grace said, as she had said countless times before and would say countless times more. "I love you too, more than all the mountains and rivers and sky." Boone pulled her close, and Grace rested her head on his broad shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of him, feeling the steady beat of his heart. In 1885, Martha passed away peacefully in her sleep. Grace grieved deeply for her grandmother, but found comfort in knowing that Martha had died happy, knowing her granddaughter was well loved and thriving. They brought the children down for the funeral, and Grace was touched by how many people from Fort Sumner came to pay their respects, including several who made a point of speaking to Boone with genuine respect and warmth. The wild mountain man and his unusual family had gradually earned the town's acceptance, if not full understanding. Martha left her house to Grace, who decided to keep it for the times they visited town. It gave them a home base in civilization, a place to stay when they needed supplies, or when the children needed exposure to other people and ideas. Grace was determined that Matt and Emma would have choices she had never had, would be comfortable in both wilderness and town, so they could decide for themselves what kind of life they wanted. As the children reached school age, Grace and Boone debated how to handle their education. Grace taught them reading, writing, and arithmetic from her books, but she worried it was not enough. Finally, they reached a compromise. Each winter, they would spend a few months in Fort Sumner, the children attending school while Boone worked in town doing carpentry and other odd jobs. Come spring, they would return to the mountains for the rest of the year. It was not a perfect solution, but it worked. Matt and Emma adapted to the dual lifestyle with the flexibility of children, equally at home in schoolroom and forest. They made friends in town but never forgot their mountain home, always eager to return when winter ended. The years flowed past, marked by the rhythm of seasons and the growth of their children. Matt shot his first elk at 12, a clean kill that made his father proud. Emma helped Grace tend a trapper who had been mauled by a bear, her steady hands and calm demeanor saving the man's life. The children were turning into remarkable young people, and Grace and Boone took deep satisfaction in watching them develop. On a summer evening in 1890, Grace sat on the porch of their cabin watching the sunset. Matt was out hunting with his father, and Emma was inside preparing dinner. Grace was 41 now, no longer the young woman who had been trapped across the river 12 years ago, but she felt no regret for the years that had passed. Each one had been full and meaningful. Boone emerged from the trees with Matt beside him, both carrying fresh meat. Matt was 17 now, nearly as tall as his father and broad-shouldered like him, wearing his hair long in mountain style. He would likely leave soon, Grace knew, to make his own way in the world. The thought made her sad, but she was also proud. They had raised him to be independent and strong, to respect the wilderness and himself. Whatever path he chose, he would walk it well. Emma came out to help with the meat, 15 now and lovely in her unconscious grace. She chattered about what she had done that day, about the herbs she had gathered and the bird nest she had discovered. She showed no signs yet of wanting to leave, but Grace knew that day would come too. Their children would grow up and forge their own paths, as children should. That night, lying in bed beside Boone, Grace reflected on the turn her life had taken. "Do you remember the day we met?" she asked. "Every detail," Boone replied. "You standing there on the bank, scared but trying not to show it, the bravest thing I had ever seen. I was terrified. Of the river, of you at first, of everything. But you trusted me anyway. Best decision I ever made." Grace rolled to face him in the darkness. "Thank you, Boone, for saving me that day, for saving me every day since." "You saved me too," Boone said quietly. "I was so alone before you. I had forgotten what it meant to belong to someone, to be part of something bigger than myself. You gave me a family, a purpose, a reason to be better than I was." They held each other in the darkness, Two people who had found each other against all odds and built a life of meaning and love. Whatever challenges the future brought, they would face them together as they always had. The children did eventually leave, though not as far or as completely as Grace had feared. Matt became a guide like his father, leading hunting parties and wagon trains through the mountains. He married a girl from Fort Sumner, a strong young woman who adapted to mountain life with grace and settled in a cabin 10 miles from his parents. Emma studied medicine with the new doctor who had come to Fort Sumner, then returned to the mountains to serve the scattered families and trappers who lived there, becoming known far and wide as a skilled healer. She too married, a trapper who understood her need for both wilderness and purpose. Grace and Boone became grandparents, their cabin filling with the sounds of grandchildren during visits. They were older now, Boone's hair streaked with silver and Grace's face lined by sun and wind, but their love had only deepened with time. They had weathered storms both literal and metaphorical, supported each other through losses and celebrated each other's triumphs. On their 20th wedding anniversary, they returned to the place where they had first met, the spot where Grace had stood trapped on the wrong side of the Pecos River. The river was calm that day, running slow and clear, so different from the terrifying flood of years ago. "I stood right here," Grace said, pointing to the bank, "watching the water rise and thinking I might die. And I was there," Boone said, indicating the opposite bank. "Saw you from higher ground and knew I had to help." "Did you know?" Grace asked, turning to him. "Even then, did some part of you know what I would come to mean to you?" Boone considered this seriously, as he considered all her questions. "No, I just knew you needed help and I could give it. But maybe," he paused, thinking, "maybe I felt something, a pull, a connection, like the river was meant to rise that day so we would meet." "Fate," Grace said. "Fate," Boone agreed, "or providence, or just extraordinary luck. Whatever it was, I am grateful for it every single day." They stood hand in hand by the river that had brought them together, and Grace thought about the girl she had been and the woman she had become. Every hardship, every challenge had been worth it for this life, this love. She had crossed more than a river that day 12 years ago. She had crossed from one life into another, from limitation into possibility. "Thank you for riding through the current for me," Grace said, as she had said many times before. "I would do it again," Boone replied, as he always did. "Every time, forever." They kissed there by the river, two people who had chosen each other and continued to choose each other every day. The water flowed past them, constant and eternal, witness to their beginning and companion to their enduring love. Years continued to pass, gentle in their rhythm. Grace and Boone grew old together in their mountain cabin, their days quieter now but no less meaningful. They took pleasure in simple things: the sunrise over the peaks, the taste of wild strawberries, the visits from children and grandchildren who filled their home with life and laughter. Boone's body showed the wear of a life lived hard, his joints stiff on cold mornings, but his mind remained sharp, and his love for Grace unwavering. He still saw her as the brave young woman who had trusted him to carry her through a raging river, and he still counted himself the luckiest man alive to have earned her love. Grace aged with grace that matched her name, her hair silver now but her spirit undimmed. She had lived a life of purpose and adventure, had raised good children and helped countless people with her healing knowledge. She had loved deeply and been deeply loved in return. What more could anyone ask? They sat together on their porch on a cool autumn evening in 1898, wrapped in blankets against the chill. The 20 years since they had married seemed impossibly long and impossibly short at the same time. So much had happened, so much had changed, yet the core of what they were remained constant. "No regrets?" Boone asked, as he sometimes did. "Not one," Grace replied firmly. You, only that I did not find you sooner. Boone took her hand, his grip still strong despite the arthritis that gnarled his fingers. But we have had good years, Grace, so many good years. We have. Grace squeezed his hand gently. And we will have more, please God. I am not done with you yet, Boone Jameson. He smiled, that rare, full smile that made his whole face light up. Good, because I am not done with you either, Grace Jameson. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set and the first stars appeared. Inside the cabin, dinner waited, but neither was eager to move. These moments of peace and companionship had become even more precious with age, and they savored them fully. Matt and Emma visited regularly with their families, bringing news and supplies and filling the cabin with noise and warmth. Grace loved these visits, loved seeing her children so capable and content, loved the grandchildren who carried forward the blend of wilderness skill and civilized learning that she and Boone had worked to instill. She had written it all down in her journals over the years, just as Martha had suggested. Volumes now lined their cabin shelf, recording the full story of their life together. Someday, when she and Boone were gone, the children would read those journals and know exactly how much they had been loved, exactly how their parents' unlikely union had come to be. But that day was far off yet, Grace told herself firmly. She and Boone had more years to share, more sunrises to watch, more quiet evenings to spend in each other's company. The river had brought them together, and their love had carried them through everything since. It would carry them through whatever remained. As the stars brightened overhead and the night sounds of the forest began around them, Grace leaned against Boone's solid shoulder, feeling the same sense of safety and rightness she had felt during that terrifying river crossing so long ago. He had rescued her that day, yes, but she had rescued him too. They had saved each other, and in doing so had built something beautiful and lasting. The river was quiet now, its spring fury long past, flowing peacefully through the valley below their mountain home. But Grace would never forget the sound of it rising, the terror and the hope, and the moment a strong mountain man had ridden through the current to bring her back, unknowingly carrying not just her body to safety but her heart to home.